Welcome to Skip the Queue, a podcast for people working in and working with visitor attractions. I'm your host, Paul Marden. The last 12 months have been the warmest of any 12-month period since records began. And while over 70% of attractions have a sustainability policy, only 12% have actually tested the CO2 emissions of their website. In today's episode, we're joined by James Hobbs, Head of Technology at Air Studios and a member of the Umbraco Community Sustainability team. James shares some easily actionable tips to reduce the emissions of your website. James, welcome to Skip the Queue. Lovely to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So we always start with some icebreaker questions. So it would be unfair if I didn't inflict the same pain on you.
Go for it.
Let's start with a nice one. I think. What actor would you want to play you in a film about your life?
That's what I want to play. I mean, instinctively, I'd say someone like Jack Black, just because I think he's really funny. It's a lot more funny than me. I'm not sure how much of a resemblance there is. He's got a much better beard than I do. Someone, if there's going to be an adaptation, I'd like it to be funny.
I like the idea of that one. I think I'd struggle with that one. I'd struggle to pick. It's got to be an archetypal geek that would play me in the story of my life. So I'm not sure who that would be.
Not John Cena.
Yeah,
or something like that.
I think so. So the next one. I'd say this one I found really hard, actually. What was your dream job when you were growing up?
Oh, okay. So I can answer that one easily because my parents still take the mickey out of me for it. So when I was quite young, I told them very kind of assertively, like, when I grow up, I want to be a part-time mechanic, part-time librarian. Which I think is very...
Well, that's an interesting job share.
Yeah, it's really, really random. I think because I love books, I love reading, and I did back then, still do now. I also like dismantling things. I was never very good at putting them back together and then continuing to work. But yeah, that was my aspiration when I was a kid. Random.
I remember going to careers advisors and just some of the tosh they would tell you. So everybody was told they could be an undertaker. And, you got the typical finance jobs, but I desperately wanted to be a pilot. And I was told by the optician I couldn't because of eyesight, which was nonsense. Right. But actually, I couldn't have done the job because I have zero sense of direction. So later in life, when I trained for my private pilot's license, I got hopelessly lost a couple of times. The RAF are very helpful, though, when that happens.
They come up, fly alongside you and tell you to get out. Get out of their airspace.
They don't like people invading the Heathrow airspace, and I was dangerously close to it at the time. So.
Oh, wow. Nice.
That's another story, though. But no, they sent me for my work experience to work in the local council finance department, which I don't think could be more different than being a pilot if you actually try.
I mean, it's not the most glamorous. I mean, it's important, but it's not quite Top Gun, is it?
No, exactly. There you go, Tom Cruise. He can play me in the film of my life. James, so we want to talk a little bit about digital sustainability. So I thought it'd be quite nice for you to tell the listeners a little bit about your background in digital and more specifically the stuff that you've been doing more recently in digital sustainability.
Okay, I'll give you the most succinct potted history I can. So I guess my background 15, 16 years ago started off as a developer, not a very good one. And since then, I've worked for a range of different sorts of organizations. So everything from a local council, national charity, global manufacturing company, and then 2 digital agencies. For the last 10 years or so, I've been more in leadership positions, but obviously have to stay close to the technology. And in more recent years, one of the big passions of mine, I suppose, or something that I'm really interested in is the sustainability side of digital, because I think it's interesting and that we can make a massive impact, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. But my current role is I'm head of technology at a creative technology studio called Air Studios, who also share my enthusiasm for sustainability. So I'm excited to do some work there.
Yeah, and my background stalking of you told me that Air does some work in the attraction sector as well, doesn't it? So you work with a few attractions.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we've got a few.
So there's some form here.
Yeah, I would say so.
Cool. One of the things that I know that you've been working with is so we're both we've spent a lot of time in the Umbraco community, and Umbraco is a content management system that a few attractions use, not many, but some tend to be larger organizations that use Umbraco typically. But we've both spent time in the Umbraco community, going to lots of events and talking to a lot of people. But one of the contributions you've made over the recent period is joining the Umbraco sustainability team. So what is it? What does it do, and who's involved in it?
Okay, so the Umbraco has this concept of community teams, which I think is Umbraco is a very unique organisation anyway. You know this because you're part of the community as well. But they have a very strong connection and link with the community of developers, and not just developers, anyone who has anything to do with Umbraco and works with it. And the sustainability team is one of the several community teams that exist. And the idea is that it brings together people from Umbraco's HQ and people from the community who have a shared passion in something relevant to Umbraco to help steer it, share knowledge, and ultimately achieve a goal. And for the sustainability community team, the goal is to, I guess it's multifaceted. Firstly, to make Umbraco as a product more sustainable, which is brilliant. Secondly, to raise awareness of what organizations or individuals need to do to be able to improve the sustainability posture of whatever they're up to, which is brilliant as well. So there's a very Umbraco focused side to it, but there's also a wider kind of awareness raising, educational side of it too, because this is a very, it's quite a new, say it's a relatively new thing. I think digital sustainability as a concept hasn't really existed for that long, unfortunately, but now it does.
Yeah, exactly. And there's been some impact as well that the team has had on the product and the direction of the product, isn't there?
Yeah. So and again, there's several of us in the community team, and I want to make it really, really clear that like a lot of work's gone on. It's not just me doing it. So we've managed to achieve a few things. So first of all, the Umbraco website, they launched a new website a little while ago. Its sustainability posture wasn't great. So we've worked with them, the people that internally that built that, to improve it, and that's made a massive difference. It's gone from being
excellent,
dirtier than a large majority of websites to being cleaner than most, which is great. We've pulled together some documentation for covering all sorts of areas from front end, back end development, content editing, and so on, to educate people on how to build more sustainable websites. And some of the team members as well have built an Umbraco package, an open source package that you can install into Umbraco, and it will advise you in terms of the pages that you're making, whether they are, good from a carbon footprint point of view or not, and will give you a rating, which is superb because it kind of brings that whole thing in much closer to the end users who'll be making the pages. So that was a really, really nice piece of work. And on top of that, we do, appear on things like this. Do webinars and talk at conferences and stuff.
Yeah, and I think Andy Everdale from Tangent is one of the members of the team, and honestly, it was Andy who totally opened my eyes to this whole subject when I first started seeing him talk about it and giving some stats, and we'll talk a little more about those later on. There's definitely an impact that the team is having. And it's really weird, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to geek out too much about Umbraco and the community, but there is something quite special about this commercial organization that has open source software that gets given away for free, that collaborates with the community to build a product which is easy to use, pretty cool, really effective, but also sustainable as well. There's not many organizations that work in that way. It's an odd, not odd. No,
it is odd in a good way.
A happy little accident.
Yeah, it's unique,
exactly.
and I love it. I think it's great. It just shows you it's possible to run a business and make money, but also have a really engaged community of passionate people and work together. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. Look, let's just take a step back from geeking out about Umbraco then. Let's talk a little bit. I want to set the scene. Okay, so. Long-time listeners will know that Rubber Cheese run a visitor attraction website survey. We've done it for 2 years in a row. This year, we simplified the survey down to make space for some more questions, and one of the key questions we've talked about is sustainability. We're just over the halfway point of the survey period, so there's still lots of responses coming in, but based on the data that we've got so far, we know that 72% of attractions in the current survey have got a sustainability policy. But only 12% of attractions have ever tested the CO2 emissions of their website. And we'll come to in a minute why we think the measurement and focusing on CO2 emissions in digital is important. But whilst very few are actually testing their site, nearly half of all of the respondents so far have attempted something to reduce the CO2 emissions of their website. So there's clearly action going on, but it's not necessarily driving in a coherent direction because there's no clear benchmarking and target setting and retesting. So, it's I think what I'd like to cover today is for us to understand that a little bit more, get under the skin of it a little bit, and then talk a little bit about how we can actually reduce the CO2 emissions. How can we actually make things different, and why we might want to do it? Because it's more than just kind of the ethical. We all should be doing something. There were some real business benefits to it as well.
Yeah.
So my next question, without stating the bleeding obvious, okay, why do you think digital sustainability matters? I mean, the obvious answer is just because it does, but it's important, isn't it, as a contributor to global warming?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots of statistics knocking around. One of which I think it shows you the scale of the impact of the digital industry is, I think, the total carbon footprint emissions of the digital industry is greater than global air traffic. And if you go and look on something like Flight Radar or Skyscanner or whatever, look at how many planes are in the air at any given moment in time. It's a pretty sobering statistic. There's lots of other ones as well in terms of the amount of electricity that's being used and water compared to, even small countries like New Zealand. So we are generating a hell of a lot of carbon directly and indirectly by doing all the things that we do. And every time you hold up your phone and you load up Instagram or TikTok or download something, there's a massive disconnect cognitively because it's just there and it just works. And, it doesn't feel like it's using up electricity and so on. But it is. There's a whole massive supply chain behind all of the lovely things we like to do on our devices that is hungry for electricity and generates pollution and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so my background was at British Airways and I was there for 10 years. It really, really wasn't that hard to spot the fact that environmentally we have a challenging problem, because when you're stood on the end of Heathrow runway, you can see what's coming out the back end of a 747 as it takes off.
Yeah.
But I don't think I ever quite understood the impact of what I do now and how that's contributing more to CO2 emissions than what I was doing previously, which, I just don't think there's an awareness of that
no.
more broadly.
Yeah, I'd agree. And it's complicated.
So, in what way?
I guess it's complicated to quantify the carbon impact of the type of work that we do in the digital industry, because I guess there's what we're shipping to end users, which is one thing, but most modern websites and applications and stuff are built on a big tower of cloud services providers, and all of their equipment has to be manufactured, which has a carbon impact, and rare earth metals need to be mined out of the grid, all of that stuff. Like, there's a big supply chain backing all this stuff, and we can influence some of that directly, but a large chunk of it we can't. So it makes choosing your suppliers quite important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're going down the road, if you accept the premise that this is a big contributor and making small gains on any of the stuff that is of interest to us and marketers who are owning websites at attractions, I think for me, probably the first step is testing and trying to figure out where you are. Do you think that's a useful first step? Is that important as far as you're concerned, James?
I think it's important because with any sort of improvement, whether it's related to sustainability or not, I think quantifying where you are at the start and having a benchmark allows you to see whether you're going in the right direction or not. And, improvement doesn't always go in one direction the whole time. There might be a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, depending on what you're doing. But I think without measuring where you are and ideally regularly measuring your progress, it's hard to say what impact you've had, and you might be, going in the wrong direction and barking up the wrong tree or whatever. So I think it's important.
So it's super important. And Is it something that marketers themselves can do, or is this something that only a sustainability consultant can do, or is there somewhere in between? Is it the techie geeks that run the website that do this, or is it a little bit of all of those things?
Well, okay, so it's a really good question. So I think this is still quite a new kind of industry. There are some tools out there that you can use to help you quantify the carbon impact of what you've got out there in the wild now. So the big one that most people talk about is websitecarbon.com, which is the website carbon calculator. That was built by, I think, a combination of an agency and some other organizations. They've come up with an algorithm. It's obviously not going to be 100% accurate because every single website app is slightly different and so on. But as a consistent benchmark for where you are and a starting point for improvement, tools like that are really good. EcoGrade is another one. Those offer non-technical routes to using them. So for the website carbon calculator, you just plonk a website address in, hit go, and it'll run off and tell you. That's not very scalable if you've got a 10,000 page website or if you've got a large digital estate. There are also API level services that are provided that might make that easier to automate. But again, you then need someone who knows how to do that sort of thing, which raises the barrier to entry. I think what I would like to see is more and more vendors building carbon dashboards into their products and services so that the rest of us don't have to run around and build all this stuff from scratch. So Azure, for example, Microsoft's cloud platform, has a carbon dashboard that is scoped to your resources. That's really interesting and useful to see. The stuff I mentioned about what we're doing with Umbraco and building a sustainability package, we're hoping to get that built into the core product. So, and again, the idea being that if you're a content editor or a marketer, you shouldn't have to know how to wire up APIs and do all this stuff. You should be able to see at a glance, okay, well, that page I've just built actually is a little bit on the heavy side. Maybe I need to look at that. So I think the way to democratize it is to make it easier to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So these tools are giving you, they're giving you a grading. Yeah. So some of them are like A to F, I think it is for website carbon. EcoGrader gives you a score out of 100, I think it is.
Yeah.
Are there any advantages to one or the other? That would, or is it a good idea for people to use both of them and see the differences that the two different tools can give you?
I think it will come down to, well, for me anyway, I think it's using a tool in the first place is a step forward from what the vast majority of people are doing currently, which is not even thinking about it. So in many ways, it doesn't really matter. I think it will depend on what people find easier to use. I think when people start to integrate this sort of sustainability measurements into their build pipelines, for example, release pipelines, that's where you will need to maybe think more carefully about the kind of data that you're interested in and what criteria you want to look at. Because, for example, at the moment, a lot of organizations who write software, hopefully their developers will be writing some unit tests, and if the tests fail, then you don't deploy the website. That should fail the build. I think it would be good to move to a world where if your sustainability posture it regresses and gets worse, then similar things happen. There are other tools outside of those websites that we've been talking about, though. So there's an organization called the Green Web Foundation, a non-profit who do a lot of work in this space, and they've created a couple of tools. One's called CO2.js, which you can integrate directly into your website. That can actually be a bit more accurate than the carbon stuff. And they've also built a tool called the Grid Intensity CLI, and without going into loads of horrible detail about what that is, essentially it knows when the electricity grid is at its most at its most pollutant, when it's generating the most carbon. So you can use that to figure out when to run background jobs or do lots of processing. You can do it when the grid is at its most renewable. So there's things like that as well. There's lots of options out there. If you can go as deep as you want with this stuff.
Amazing. One thing that you just mentioned that I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. I've never thought of that before, is the idea that, so you can drop a URL into Website Carbon or EcoGrader and it will give you the score of that page. But actually, if you've got lots of pages on your website, you need to be testing across multiple pages.
Yeah,
it's just never occurred to me before.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people plonk the homepage in and go, "Cool, it's A." But I guess it's a effort versus reward thing. Like hopefully no one's going to spend time manually entering 10,000 website URLs into a tool like that. Not least because it would probably take the tool down. That there are probably better ways of doing it than that. And also, homepages are typically quite different to the rest of a website. It serves a different purpose. So I think testing a representative portion of your digital services is probably the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been wondering recently whether buyers should be thinking about this as something that's part of the requirements of a new website. So if you're going out to tender and buying a new website, oftentimes you and I will both see requests for proposal that have accessibility requirements in them. But I genuinely don't remember a time that I've ever seen an RFP say you must achieve grade C or above on website carbon across the majority of the pages on the site. And I think when buyers start to do that, you'll begin to see agencies doing more of this sort of stuff.
I think you're absolutely right.
Baking it into contracts will make a big difference.
Yeah, and it's that kind of selective pressure, isn't it? If clients start requiring this stuff, then agencies will have to step up, and it's unfortunate that might well be the catalyst. But actually, I don't care what the catalyst is, as long as we're going in the right direction is the main thing, really, which is lessening our impact. But that whole supply chain thing is huge. That's one way we can make a big impact is by mandating certain things. And there's actually a certification, a green software engineering certification that's offered for free that developers or technical architects can go through to educate them a bit on green software engineering techniques and things like that. And that's the kind of thing that hopefully in the future companies who are putting RFPs out might say, we want your engineering team to be aware of green computing techniques and so on and be able to prove it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised as well. We talked about this when we met previously, that it gets legislated for as well. So in the same way as public sector bodies have got to meet certain accessibility requirements, I would not be surprised if we enter a world soon where there's a statutory obligation for these things to be done in a sustainable way as well. So getting your act together now is a really good thing to do because there's going to be less work later on when you've got no choice but to do it.
Exactly. Get ahead of the game now.
Exactly. So we've made the case. People have bought into it. They're going to go and do some testing, and they realise that they've got a smelly, polluting, rich website. What can they do next? How can your average head of marketing, head of digital, influence their website to get better?
Yeah. Okay. So this is where I think there's a really nice angle here. We did talk about this earlier on, but there is a fairly close link between the things that will make your website, your digital services more sustainable, and the kind of KPIs and metrics that will probably make it more commercially successful as well, depending on what you're doing, with a bunch of caveats that I won't go into. So, for example, sustainable websites are typically lightweight, they're fast, they're optimized for getting the right things in front of the user as quickly as possible, which can include everything from content delivery networks to optimizing images to the whole host of stuff. Doing all of those things will also typically positively impact your search engine optimization, positively impact your conversion. Because if you look at Google's guidance, the Lighthouse guidance, the different things it looks at and so on, it's very, very clear that fast, relevant websites are what get prioritized and what Google's looking for. Fast, relevant websites that are served from locations close to the user are also likely to be sustainable. So there is a link there. And what that means is there's a built-in business case for doing this sustainability stuff. So if you've got a hard-nosed suite of executives who couldn't care less about the planet, not that I'm saying that that's what everyone's like, but the commercial world that we live in, it's a hell of a lot easier to sell this stuff in by saying, do you know what, as well? Like we can do an MVP or a pilot and we're confident that we might be able to improve conversion by 0.1%, 0.5%, whatever it might be. It's also typically a good way to save money by being smarter about what you're computing and where and when, and using some of those tools that I've talked about. You can save yourself potentially a bunch of money as a business, which again is a commercial win. So I think whilst the ethical side of it is really important, and none of us want to be boiling to death in 50 years' time because we've ruined the planet, making small changes in digital can have a massive impact because of the amount of people that are using them. And I think it's easier to sell in because of the commercial stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm guessing this stuff that you can do at key stages in the design and development of a site. So what are the things that people should be thinking about during the design of the site that could make it more sustainable?
So that's a really good question. So this is a huge topic. So I can give you some examples of the kind of things you should be thinking about. So I guess we could divide them up into two sections. So when we're designing a website, there's how it looks and how the user experience works. There's also the technical design. As with anything, the earlier you start thinking about this kind of stuff, the easier it is. Crowbarring in, it's a bit like accessibility. You know this. You try and crowbar it in the last week of the project, it's not going to work. So from a design point of view, and some of this stuff is difficult to quantify its impact in detail, but things like not having massive 4K full bleed videos at the top of your web page. So being very careful and intelligent use of things like that, because they are large. They have to be transferred from wherever you're serving them from to the user. There's a big energy cost associated with that. Not using loads and loads of external dependencies on your web pages, and that could be anything from fonts to JavaScript libraries to the vast myriad of tools that are being used. The more things you're throwing down the pipe to your end user, especially if your hosting infrastructure is not set up in a distributed way, the more energy intensive that kind of thing is. And you can even go as far as looking at the color choices that you're using. So certain like darker themes are typically less energy intensive. Because of how OLED screens and modern screens work. Again, very, very hard to quantify. And then we go down the rabbit hole of, but where does the electricity that charges my phone come from? And like, if you try and quantify all that stuff, it gets very, very head exploding. But there are things you can do in that sense. Some of them are easier to quantify than others. So the weight of the page is a very easy thing to measure, right? If you keep that low, it'll be easier to cache. It will load quicker for users. It'll be better for SEO, and faster pages tend to have better conversion. And that works whether you're selling things from an e-commerce point of view or you're trying to register interest from whatever it might be. From a technical angle, I think one of the most impactful things you can do beyond making sure that your code is optimized and is running at the right times at the right place is simply to consider using a content delivery network. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with a content delivery network, so a CDN is something that all of us have interacted with at one point or another, but probably without realizing. In the traditional way of having a website, you've got some servers somewhere in a data center somewhere. And when someone types your website address in, it goes and fetches that information from the web server, and back comes a web page in the simplest sense. Now, if your website servers live in Amsterdam and your users on the west coast of America, that's a big old trip for that information to come back and forth. And it's got to go through lots of different hops, uses up lots of energy. A content delivery network is basically lots and lots of servers dotted all over the planet in all of the major cities and things like that can keep a copy of your website. So that if someone from the west coast of America says, I'm really interested in looking at this website, types the address in, they get the copy from a server that might be 10, 20, 50 miles away from them instead of several thousand across an ocean. So it loads quicker for the user, which is great from a user experience, SEO, all that stuff I talked about. But it's also great from an energy point of view because it's coming from somewhere nearby and it's not having to bounce around the planet. That's one thing that you could do that will make a massive and immediate impact commercially and from a sustainability point of view.
So you get those you get the performance improvement for the people all the way around the world accessing the site. But it's going to take load off of the server itself, so you might need less powerful servers running. one of the big issues that attraction websites have got is that it's such a cyclical market. The people
Spiky.
that, when the Christmas Meet Santa train is released at an attraction, all the traffic to the website is going to peak. If you can keep some of that traffic off of the web server by using that content delivery network instead, you're going to be able to withstand those really peak times on the website without having to spend lots and lots of money on improving the resilience of the service.
Yeah, it's a great point.
So it really is a win-win-win, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. And also it can help potentially avoid things like the dreaded queue, where you log onto a website that's busy and it sticks you in a queue and you're 41,317th in the queue or whatever. And exactly like you say, if you can leverage this tech to take the load off your back-end systems, and you'll be delivering a better user experience.
One of the measures that I know a lot of the algorithms that are assessing CO2 emissions look at is the type of hosting that you use. So they talk about green hosting. What is green hosting, and is all green hosting the same?
No. So yeah, again, this is a big topic. So I guess hosting generally runs the spectrum all the way from kind of more boutique sort of providers who can set up VMs or private servers or whatever, all the way through to the big Goliaths of the internet, the AWS and Azure and so on, and everything in between. Yep. So green hosting is broadly hosting that is carbon neutral or powered by renewables, that sort of thing. So in theory, shouldn't be pumping more pollutants into our atmosphere than it's saving. So different. If we look at the big cloud providers initially, so they've all made some commitments in terms of improving their sustainability posture, and this is really good because
absolutely,
when one does it, the other one has to do it too. And obviously, there's Google Cloud Platform as well, and they're doing similar sorts of things. But it's almost this. I like the competitive angle of this because it's all it means is that the sustainability posture of all of them will get better quicker. So it's good. So for example, and I'll try and do this off the top of my head. You should check yourselves, but Azure and AWS and Google all have some pages that talk about their commitments, and primarily they're focused on carbon neutrality and using renewable electricity. AWS have done a good job of that. Yeah. So in certain AWS regions, the year before last, they were completely 100% renewable powered, which is brilliant.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Not everywhere. Azure are going down a similar path, and they've made the same commitment in terms of the year when they're going to hit renewable powered everything. They've also made commitments to water positivity. Enormous amounts of water are used during the operation of data centers, and there are a lot of these data centers. So they've made commitments, I think, by 2035 or 2040. Please double check to be net water positive, which is great. And the other thing that people don't think about, and this is the supply chain thing I was talking about earlier, all those servers, they've got rare metals in them, they've got all kinds of stuff in them that's been dug out of the ground, often in areas where there's a lot going on from a human point of view. So Amazon, AWS, Google, etc., they're looking at that angle too. How can they keep servers in commission for longer so they don't need to be replaced as often? Where are they getting their materials from, etc.? All that kind of stuff, because they're not just a computing company. They're invested in the hardware and getting this stuff out of the ground and manufacturing it and all the rest of it. It's a very, very big operation. So that's something we can't influence beyond pressuring them as consumers, but it is something that they're doing something about, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we go back to that point I made earlier on, buyers are in control of this. If they are choosing to include that in their contracts to buy new web services, that it needs to be green by offsetting or green by using 100% renewable power, then that drives change, doesn't it? Procurement managers drive change through that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final point on the green hosting. The Green Web Foundation, who I mentioned earlier, a non-profit who work in this space, they maintain a list of green web hosts, so hosts that are known to be green that you can use without having to worry too much. So it's worth looking at that as well. And it's a kind of impartial list.
Excellent. Do you think this is a story that attraction should be telling? So they're going to be, we're hoping that people are going to become energized by this, and they're going to want to go on a digital sustainability journey. Do you think that is that something that they could be shouting about?
I think so, if done in the right way. So obviously you've got to be careful of the sort of, we planted some trees and now everything's fine, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. But I think talking about it in the right way, which is, we know we're not perfect, but we're doing something about it, and this is our plan, and being transparent about it, I think is a good thing. I think it will also foster competition between different attractions, and everyone's a winner, really, because it will make everyone more sustainable.
Yeah.
And I don't see why you shouldn't talk about it. I think it's something that's important. And to your point earlier about, consumers being able to influence some of this stuff, I really, truly hope that the generation of youngsters that are coming up now are going to be more hyper aware of this sort of thing, and they're going to care a lot more, because it's likely to affect them more than it will us. So I would like to think that they will be selecting products, services, attractions, whatever it might be, that can demonstrate that they're actually doing something to lessen the impact of their operations. I've got 2 relatively young children, and I can already see them asking questions and being interested in this kind of stuff in a way that wouldn't have occurred to me when I was a kid. Just didn't think about it. Can't change that, but what we can do is try and improve the world that we're going to be leaving to the youngins.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one last question for you: is there anything happening in this space that you think is really cool and interesting to think about?
That's a good question. I mean, I hope this isn't a non-answer. I think the thing that is exciting me most is that more and more people are talking about this stuff. More and more people are asking questions about this stuff. And I've done a lot of talks and webinars and things on this topic. And the thing that really makes me feel positive and excited about it is that nearly all of them afterwards, people come up to you, they message you and say, I just didn't realize, So the fact that we're able to raise awareness is brilliant, because we can start to build up a bit of momentum. I think the thing that I think I mentioned it earlier, products and services building this sort of stuff into their platforms in terms of helping users use their services more efficiently. I think that's the area that I'm most excited about, because otherwise it's people kind of hacking stuff together. I think it should be a first class part of any solution, really, is like, what's the carbon impact of what I'm doing? That's what I'm probably most keen to see more of.
James, thank you. One last thing, we always ask our guests for a book recommendation, and you've already said you're an avid reader, so no pressure, but I'm quite excited to hear about this one.
Well, there's 2, and I thought I'd just make the decision when you asked me the question about which one to recommend. So I'm going to go with my legitimately favourite book, which is The Player of Games by Ian M. Banks. It's part of the Culture series of novels, and I'm a bit upset because Elon Musk has been talking about it. I feel like he's tarnished it slightly. A magnificent series of novels. I remember finishing, there's 10, and I remember finishing the 10th one, and sadly the author died a while ago, and I genuinely felt slightly bereft that there weren't going to be any more of them. It's a brilliant book. It's exciting. It's exciting. It's so creative and inventive. It makes you think differently about things. It's definitely not one for children. There's a lot of violence and all kinds of other things in there, but it's a fascinating book. All of his books are fascinating. My favorite author. So if you're thinking about getting into his books, and specifically the culture novels, that's a great point to jump in at. It's accessible and it's absolutely brilliant. I love it.
Oh, that's quite the recommendation. So, listeners, if you want to get into this culture series of books, then when we post the show notice on X, get over there and retweet the message and say, I want James's book.
Yeah.
And the first person to do that will get that sent to them.
And here it is. So just to prove
it. Oh, look at that.
It's a great book.
James, this has been brilliant. There's a couple of takeaways I want people to go and think about. One from me, which is go and test your site, and then jump into the Rubber Cheese website survey, go to rubbercheese.com/survey. Tell us all about your attractions website, and one of those questions will be about, have you tested the CO2 emissions of your site and have you done anything about it? The more we understand what the sector is doing, then the more we can understand how we can all help and improve things. And James, you had one idea of a place where people could go and find out more about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's some organisations that I mentioned. So the Green Web Foundation is one that's got lots of interesting material on there, both tools that they've made, but also they fund research in this space, and which is really, really important. It should be treated like a specific discipline, I suppose. They're doing some great stuff there. There's the Green Software Foundation, which is a confusingly similar name, doing some good work in this space. There's also lots of interesting groups on Discord, forums that are out there. I think my main message would be, we're all learning more about this field. No one has all the answers, but there are organisations out there that you can come and speak to that can help you understand where you are currently. And I definitely encourage you guys to fill in the survey, as Paul said, because the more information that we've got, the better we can understand where things are.
James, this has been a lot of fun and really interesting. Thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining the podcast.
No, thanks for having me on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to Skip the Queue. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others to find us. Skip the Queue is brought to you by Rubber Cheese, a digital agency that builds remarkable systems and websites for attractions that helps them to increase their visitor numbers. You can find show notes and transcripts from this episode and more over on our website, skipthequeue.fm.